Hey folks, I'm going to give a minute or two for others to join and we'll get started. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get things started. This is the February 19th, 2019 meeting of the working group talking about the support stance of Kubernetes and exploring that problem space. This is a community public meeting that's being recorded. We'll post it to YouTube and we ask that everybody adhere to our code of conduct. I've just pasted the agenda doc link into the Zoom. I'm guessing most of you have seen it since you're here because that's where we have our Zoom meeting link, but just for reference. We've got a couple things on the agenda today, talking about Tim St. Clair's initial brainstorming on a potential KEP around stable versus devel, and Justin Santa Barbara talking about dependencies, and then Davel to talk about the survey. So we'll go ahead and start with Tim St. Clair, and we'll maybe give 15 minutes or so to talk about this.
Okay. So I linked to the formations of a KEP and tried to highlight some bits. And as I talk, feel free. Everyone should have edit rights. So who has the link? So if you see aspects inside of the this doc that are missing, feel free to amend or add them as I start to talk about them. But the goal of this conversation is to outline what I've talked at many times before about a devel and stable series. And I'll give you some context and history around this and why I think it's a good thing for Kubernetes. So let me switch my camera view for the time being, and you can play along in the doc as well. So there's a couple of key constraints that kind of exist today. One is that one of the key constraints is that users or administrators in Kubernetes have a desire to have longer-term support lifecycle, right? And currently, that's not really supported, and they're forced to upgrade every 9 months. That's one of the key constraints. One of the other key constraints is that Google in particular, and other folks would like to be able to release more often and get feedback signal from the community about the state of features and enhancements to those features. So the goal of this proposal is to try and find a happy path between the two. And it's based upon how we used to do things with a bunch of grid technologies. So that should hopefully frame the conversation. Now let's get into the details. So there's basically the model of having two streams, a devel stream and a stable stream, or what we call series, right, if you want to call it that. Within a devel series or stream, you basically have a monthly cadence. As long as it meets a minimum bar, you release every single month. All the artifacts are published through a devel channel. And as part of that monthly release process, you basically give notifications to a certain set of VIPs or MVP people that you care about that basically test your bits at regular intervals, right? The purpose of having these sort of VIP customers or consumers is you give them some benefits in the community. You give them speaking talk engagements as part of KubeCon. You talk to them early and often about these new features that are coming down the pike. You basically incentivize them to want to install and beat on these different new features that are coming. Right? So every month or so, once it meets the minimum criteria, it's always released. So the purpose of this too is also to force automation, because if you're releasing this often, if it's not a completely automated system, you'll be backed up against people, right? So at the end of a 12-month cycle or a year time frame, this time frame could be, determined by the release team. But ideally, after a year time frame, you start a new stable series, and all it is a rebase. So you would start a new stable series, and you go through a hardening window. The purpose of the hardening window is basically to ensure that all the knobs are twiddled properly. The state of features for a given release across this entire devel series are confirmed to be at state, alpha, beta, whatever. And you also verify that your migration path is clean from stable series to stable series. Usually in my history, this has been, with other systems, this has taken about on the order of a month or two on average, in part because there were requirements as part of hardening. Like you had to have your docs in place. You weren't allowed to release until you had all of these other criteria that were met. And then once that occurred, you'd have the new stable series. So then there's often a question that happens, like how many different stable series would you support? In history, the stable series that we did this with other systems that were part of the grid was a 2-year window, right? So you would have 2 stable series in support at any moment in time. The one thing that we had in the past was we had criteria for bugs. What bugs were allowed to be pushed through stable series? We don't currently have that. It's very subjective as it exists today. But basically, only CVEs and breaking things or known regressions were allowed to get as bug fixes as part of stable series. Everything else had to go through devel, and the train kept on running. Right? So if a person missed a series, well, they're going to have to wait a while before they can get the fixes for those things. And you have to go through a process in order for you to get a bug fixed, right? To make sure that it was clear and clean and well documented as part of the release errata for that. We do some of this today, but it's not necessarily the most clear process in the world, and sometimes people kind of circumvent it at different areas. So this is the basic premise of it. There's a bunch of logistics that I kind of skipped over, but I know you gave me a 15-minute window, so I wanted to pause there to start a conversation to see what folks initially thought about this. And if they had any questions regarding it.
I have a question, if no one else does.
Sure.
I was just wanting to understand the practical delta. So that arrow that you've been pointing at a lot that goes from the developer series, yeah, that arrow there. So basically, if I understand correctly, you're transferring the developer stream to the LTS or whatever we call this.
You're basically creating a branch. It's just exactly the way master branch is created.
But at that point, the two are identical. And then you're applying, I think, what you estimated to be a month of hardening.
Yes.
So the delta between the devel series and the LTS series at that point is very small. And the same argument goes for those monthly releases at the top there. I mean, are those monthly releases actually materially different than what's at head at any point in time?
The devel is head, pretty much. So the only difference
you have these monthly releases of head, which are somehow different than just pick a random head. These are like somehow blessed monthly releases of head, right?
Yes, you have to pass a certain criteria. A minimum bar must be met in order for you to actually do the release. So it has to pass a series of tests. You could have a bunch of commits in between here that actually break something. Also, another stipulation that was kind of overlooked, which is not which is going to be written down, is actually listed in the doc, is that you enable certain devel features as part of your devel release. So typically, we're very conservative with our releases, and we make sure that everything's feature gated as part of it. But the whole intent of having a devel series release is to get that feedback signal to enable those features.
Okay. I mean, I guess my overall feedback is it feels like there isn't actually a big material difference between essentially 3 different kinds of releases that we've identified, or 4 in fact. So there's stuff that gets into head, which goes through all the CI and blocking changes and everything else. So there's a barrier there. There's a not very much bigger barrier by the sounds of things to getting to the monthly release, because in practice that's basically going to be whatever head looks like at that month.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, there's not a much bigger barrier between that and the quarterly release on the devel stream. And then the what did we call it, the stable release at the bottom, is essentially a snapshot of the devel release at some point.
It's a snapshot, but you also disable, you basically turn your feature gates back on, right? So the purpose of hardening is that you set the criteria for the features for a given release, as well as making sure that documentation is in place for that release cycle. So it is different. So the configuration could be vastly different than what
primarily configuration and documentation change. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So the whole purpose is to get feedback signal early for features that are under development, right? Because currently today, the only feedback signal we have is from developers itself, which is notoriously bad. So we release a feature and then we kind of do this promotion cycle without necessarily actually having direct feedback from initial customers or clients, consumers.
Would we get better feedback? Or would we end up getting feedback from early adopters only?
It depends how you structure the VIPs / the most, the VIP structure for this. How do you incentivize people to be involved in this process? In the past, so to give you a little more context, we did this as part of what was called Open Science Grid. There were layers of tools that came together as part of it, and Condor was one of those key pieces, or the layer, part of the tool chain. And we had this process that evolved over 15 plus years, and Condor was installed on thousands of government labs across the entire Open Science Grid. And we needed a way to signal to those folks that they could test out new features and federate workloads to those devel clusters to get signal back. But they also, for their core clusters, they could always rely on the stable series. So that gives a little more context or background of where this comes from and why.
Speaking of someone who actually does do, I'm more of an end user than a developer. So there's the thing that I like about this is that it makes the distinction clear between what devel and stable is. Like you don't need to read much documentation to understand what's going on. I think that the problem that I see is that for Kubernetes there's kind of like there's so many different surfaces that have versioning that maybe this is something that your previous experience, Tim, had worked with, but there's so many different things that have versioning that currently have, a whole bunch of, there's sort of the deprecation policies around object types and stuff like that. It feels like that will be difficult to munge into this, into this sort of design.
So I actually patently disagree with that, but that's okay. We can talk about it. The whole purpose of this is to determine and get feedback if your APIs that you're creating are sane, right? It's a develop series, so if you're developing against Kubernetes proper, you get feedback, early warning signal along the way, whether or not you should actually promote this API. So currently the way API promotion works, and Jordan's on the call, is it's completely arbitrary. And we promote things based upon developer signal, not necessarily customer signal or feedback loop of the use cases around given APIs. So like we tried to rush promotion of CSI this cycle, right? And there was no early warning signal along the way of this makes sense or this is the right thing to do based upon the feedback from consumers. This was just done arbitrarily by developers because they wanted to get it to a known state for consumption. Right? If the consumption model was ahead of time, where a person could actually use it before they actually, bought into what this new API looks like, they would be able to shape the state and understand the warts that exist with this feature. And then promotion would occur only after you've gotten the signal back, right? So you would actually stay, this this feature clearly is not baked given the feedback we got from the wild.
Okay, yeah, sure. That sounds quite reasonable. It was more just, I mean, we do currently use, or we in the past have used a whole bunch of stuff when it was alpha, or so, and and we've been okay with changing stuff as we used it because we wanted to use it straight away, and it hasn't. We actually haven't had that much pain with the API schema version changes in general, but and so I don't. Yeah, I'm not like hard against it or anything, man. It was more just I wanted to have talked about it. That's all.
No, it's good. Like it's totally okay for us to disagree on something and have a conversation about it. That's totally fine.
There were two points that I wanted to mention. One, if the stable version possibly has pretty drastically different configuration than the dev version, then some people look at dev as, or their expectation around dev is, I run dev, and if it's good, then I should be good on the next stable version. And this this approach wouldn't necessarily validate that. Like, if you're running dev, that might have no relation to the next snapshot stable version that comes out.
That's
so,
totally true. We should.
I mean, that's just like good communication around like what we mean by this.
Yeah, I agree.
The point about being able to change or add or remove APIs, especially in more drastic ways, and kind of having this dev stream where we have more freedom, I guess it sounded like, to kind of make bigger changes. We need more separation than just config on off. Like, once we still have issues, once we ship a stable version that has like types with these fields and structs, we still can't change the structure of those field names. So some of the issues around the way we promote APIs and things are mechanical, given the way objects are encoded, decoded, and things like that. So even if we like left it in dev for 2 years and never enabled it in stable, if there were stable versions that had those types with that structure, we couldn't change the structure of those field names. So some of it is mechanical.
Yeah. I think part of this has to do, this is kind of release mechanics more so than like the details of how you do versioning of different features is totally arbitrary based upon the technology. This is a release mechanism. So if we, it applies pretty generically. It's very analogous to like the idea of like a Fedora /RHEL series, right? Where you're constantly checking out and testing out the latest versions of what you're trying to get out in the wild. And the RHEL is the downstream model of like, these are more tested, validated configurations that, we have some level of guarantees that we're giving you.
So, like you, I've worked on Linux. I also worked at Mozilla for a while. And my experience is having defined developer alpha, whatever it is, streams, doesn't really change who tests the development versions. It's still your developers and your redistributor customers who do pretty much all of the actual testing. And it's very hard to get end users to pay any attention to them. I'm not saying it would be any worse than the current situation, because we have that situation right now with alpha features. But my experience with other projects is that it also wouldn't be any better.
It all based upon incentivization. Who's incentivized to use develop things and test them, right? So a lot of times you're totally correct. There are sort of high value targets. The developers have a tendency to use the develop series, but certain customers who bleed on the edge or who want certain features also have a develop cluster in their environment. But without incentives, for most people will still be using stable. That's because they will want a stable target. The whole premise of getting value out of devel is entirely based upon actually having people consume the devel series and incentivizing that structure so that way you get that early warning signal that helps to shape what should be in the next stable series. Without that, this model is essentially worthless, to be honest. You're on mute, Tim.
Back on Jordan's comment, I'm wondering if implicit here is some slight difference, and if that becomes a problem then between what alpha and beta mean on devel and the same code if it was branched or rebased into the stable series. Like, once it's there, people could use it. In devel, they're supposed to, and the things are meant to be under development and changing, but that same code having been pulled into stable at that sort of forking point, the downward arrow, are they going to explicitly be under non-support there?
So
I can't read that. Or I can't read that. What does that
this
say?
is branch.
Oh, there we go. Nope, still can't read.
You got to maximize the screen. So the question is, if they used it in devel, that doesn't guarantee that it'll be turned on and stable. And yes, that's true, but that's an expectation thing that has to be documented, right? A part of the hardening phase should be documenting what features exist and what's the differentiation. Like, why was this thing enabled? Why was this thing not enabled? What things got promoted from alpha to beta? Very analogous to what we do, but actually, I would say stricter. We kind of YOLO it in many ways. In fact, we totally YOLO it. We try to do our best guess at what's there today, but I think a part of formalizing the hardening phase is you don't release until you've actually had the people who've dotted the I's and crossed the T's. Because there are many scenarios that exist today where we release and the documentation's wrong, the feature set's wrong, the state of things is wrong. This has happened across a number of releases.
So last year we made a shift from saying that beta could change to beta is, like, you aren't changing the APIs. Like, beta is supposed to be stable code, maybe not in terms of APIs, but maybe there's bugs still. So would this practically mean if something had moved over to the stable series as a beta symbol foo, and then it needed change, that we would throw away a whole set of code and duplicate it so that somebody had started using it? Like, would we really go that strict?
I don't understand what beta stable means.
Right, so in terms of APIs, that we don't change symbols and APIs. Alpha, implicit, they are changing, right? And beta, they used to change, but they were supposed. Tim Hawkins sent out an email last year saying, like, because we want people to start using them, we're going to give a stability statement on those APIs that we will not change APIs once they hit beta level.
We've never changed beta APIs in ways that broke serialization, or to my knowledge, we never have. I mean, if we did, so that was a broken release. So
okay, so if it's happened in the past, it was accidental, and we would definitely be intending to not do that for beta.
Yeah. So Tim, we have so many Tims. Tim Sinclair, are you envisioning devel is actually like a master branch, and all of these features in various states of progress, some about ready to graduate, some not ready at all to graduate, are actually merged into a single branch?
It's basically the state of master.
Okay.
So devel is basically master. And this is only a branch when you create the new stable series.
And what is the delta of the branch? Basically just config defaults, like enablement, disablement defaults?
Yeah, pretty much. For the first phase, there might be bug fixes that get merged through, once you actually go through the hardening phase, once you actually do upgrade tests. Like, there's no guarantees for upgrade tests in this scenario. The bar is lower. So, as part of devel series, you can feel free to break things, and that's okay. So if you are in this state, you want to get signal, you could have the signal be read for a period of time, and it's still okay to release it. But that's part of the idea of devel is to release early, release often, right?
Yeah. So, but you could only break things that haven't been released in any form in stable, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But wait, now I'm missing something. So our current head is intended to be stable, maybe not stable enough for production, but I mean, it consistently passes CI/CD tests, and you can deploy it and use it. And many people do, maybe not in like.
What planet do you live on, Quentin? Because that has never been the case. I've been in this project for 4.5 years since the very beginning, and I've never seen that be true.
We don't let things into head that break decoding existing data.
APIs, yes, but functionality and features can be totally busted, and they have been busted for extended periods of time. So you can't even consume head. Like, you can consume pieces of head, but you can't actually deploy live clusters of head, not without a lot of work. So like today, all the artifacts aren't continuously published on head, right? So if you go to the master branch, you can't actually you could build a cluster, but it's a lot of sweat and work, right? The turnkey automation for what we actually do as part of a release is not done for every single head as a part of a nightly release or something like that.
Right. I think we have the every 3-week cadence of alphas cut.
Well, I mean, to clarify that, we do build packages. We do build binaries. Sorry, we build binaries of every revision, but we do not build packages of every revision.
Correct.
But maybe I need to clarify my understanding then. Do we or do we not, per PR, actually run a bunch of tests, some of which, at least on a fairly regular basis, like as in daily, involve building a cluster that actually works and that you can run tests against? I believe we do. Justin's nodding.
We do.
So that, to me, constitutes a working cluster. I mean, it's not broken in the sense that it doesn't come up or you can't run, a few hundred tests against it.
There's layers to this onion. There are PR blocking jobs, which give you a certain level of signal. Then there are periodics. And then there are upgrade jobs, which are only really checked, which are periodic, but are only really checked as part of once you get closer into the alpha beta release category. So today, the periodics are only run, and you only get signal from that after a PR has been merged. And oftentimes, what you will see is after a PR gets merged, it can fundamentally break certain levels or sets of tests across the board. And this has been known to be true for eons now.
That's true, though those do get attention. There are small sets of them that get higher levels of attention, and then a long tail that gets very little attention.
Yes.
For things like the upgrade tests, when those are read, issues do get opened and do get resolved. So right now, the upgrade test, the most recent green run was today. So I'm not disputing that they are flaky, and I'm not disputing that there is potential for breakage, but they do gate the alpha releases, and they do get raised.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and the other question, I guess, is
time order. The
sorry, Tim.
alphas are less periodic, and some of you have things that can stay read for a couple of weeks quite commonly. So if you just go to the really simple statement that Quentin made, like at any time, more or less, it's releasable. For something you care about, that's quite likely not true for somebody out there. If you're doing something simple, probably true. Most of the time, within a few weeks at the most.
Yeah, but that seems to me to converge to the description of the devel branch, which is at a period order of weeks, month-ish. There may be some series of commits in the middle where stuff was broken or had a side effect that we didn't anticipate. But we do have some level of signal that, at a 3-week or 1 month or order of weeks period, we can say, yeah, upgrade job is green, periodics are green, at least the ones we consider release blocking.
One of the really nice things that this potentially does is by shortening that window, it gets us closer to that goal that Quentin, I think, was looking for there, that master is always releasable. One of the things that people have talked about shortening the cycle does is force you to care sooner because you have less stabilization. It's not like, next month's the stabilization period. It's much more immediate.
So one of the questions I would have is, how is this different than like the existing CI job that enables all alpha features? And our alpha release cadence. If the alpha CI job that enables all alpha features is green, and our periodics are green, and we cut an alpha release maybe more regularly, maybe every 3 weeks, every month, how is the devel branch different than that?
I think it's just a formalization. I think it's just a name for the most part, and an expectation from consumers. I think the current problem that exists, I don't think you can actually get all the release artifacts, including the RPMs and debs, in the alpha series still.
The RPMs and debs, I think you're right. I think those haven't been cut.
Isn't the more interesting, we're talking about what this implies about the devel series. I think the more, in terms of answering the broader question, the interesting part is what this implies about the stable series. And particularly what not just support commitments, and believe me, I can't tell you how many times I've heard the phrase N-1 in the last couple of months. But also what the upgradability commitment is between stable series.
I think Justin had his hand raised.
I didn't quite catch that. Was there a question there?
Yeah, the question, I guess, was that one of the, in some ways, devel will have some of the characteristics, or at least monthlies or quarterlies off of devel will have the characteristics of upgradability between versions that releases do now. What are we willing to say about upgradability on stable or between stable generations?
It's strict version semantics, very similar to how we do version semantics for K8s today, is that it's an N-1 upgrade, forced upgrade path, because you have to do that for API conversioning.
Okay, but stable releases will have had, are we moving that burden over to stable, and are we forcing APIs to stabilize even in devel for longer periods? Because, we may go through generations of changes in devel before they come out in stable.
Yeah, if the supported SKU is still N-1 of stable and the cadence of stable slows down to yearly, then
right,
that means an API change now takes 2 years to
yep,
roll out.
Yes.
And I have a bit of a question on that, actually, because it seems like a lot of this conversation assumes that all of the cadence of alpha to beta versus stable for the APIs is all going to remain exactly the same. For those of you who've worked on systems where you've had this type of release, does the existence of a stable branch, the stable release, become an artificial target to change the cadence of the alpha versus beta versus stable APIs?
Sometime, I would say artificial, it becomes a forcing function for sure. So I think the one thing it does is the hardening phase, as part of becoming stable, forces you to really think about what promotion means versus forcing the promotion based upon signal from the wild. Because like right now, we've promoted a bunch of APIs, or in the process of also trying to promote APIs based upon developer perspective, right? Very early in the life cycle, to be honest. And usually we don't change things, or we change things ad hoc later on, or add fields to APIs or features in general, because there's a bunch of features that aren't just APIs, right? There's if you look at the sheer number of knobs that exist on the API server, that's an obscene number of features. So that level of feedback to understand, like, if this feature doesn't work for me, or is not exactly the shape or orientation that I would expect to make it useful, that feedback and having that signal is useful. But again, this whole premise is entirely predicated on incentivizing people to use Devel and having all the artifacts there.
Does the corollary to that mean that the N+1 of stable is suddenly a whole dump of a bunch of alpha features?
The N+1 of stable.
So you've cut your stable. The next Devel release, is that where everybody says, okay, time to throw in a whole bunch of alpha features?
It just, the Devel series goes on and continues regardless of stable. So it just keeps on trucking based upon whatever the needs are. So like if a person wants, or if a team or a SIG wants to do features, they do it irregardless of the time window of stable. I think the one benefit here is there's no lockdown, right? Master or Devel keeps on trucking irregardless to everything else. And the branch then goes through a hardening phase.
So to put this maybe in a little more explicit terms, I think what I'm hearing Noah describe, I've definitely seen in the past in the Linux world, having worked for a couple of hardware vendors. There was a pressure to get enablement code into the Linux kernel ahead of a given RHEL release that was going to pick up the given kernel version. So you had a push to get early code, often even before hardware availability, in so that it was there, and then you would debug it later, but you had this initial hurdle that you had to clear of presence in an alpha beta state of something that maybe even meant it had never been tested outside of a simulator.
I don't think that's any different than today.
Yeah, I think that's a normal industry thing that happens, and the answer that I would give to Noah is that at that point you need maintainers in those core projects who understand that this happens and push against it and have clear established quality criteria and really are prepared to say no in the face of somebody who really wants the answer to be yes. And that somebody is somebody with a lot of dollars relative to the project, so that the situation can be very awkward. So
to give some context here too, it was very common for in the past in the grid landscape to have different sites that would have multiple clusters, Devel and stable series clusters, because developers who were trying to target the next series wanted access to the features in order for them to program to get ready for the next stable series, right? That cadence gave developers time to know and vet their development for a given feature or leveraging of a given feature, time to understand, and to write their code against it. So when the stable series hit, that their project, which was dependent upon the core, could then be released along with the core, right? So if I'm a downstream developer of some kind, creating a new feature based upon latest of CRDs, and I wanted to make sure that everything is compatible and working properly, I'm constantly using the Devel series on an actual Devel cluster to get it up to snuff as part of my getting ready for the stable series.
So this has been good conversation. I want to make sure that we have time to talk about the couple other things on the agenda. We've got sort of a set of notes here in the meeting agenda and the sketch of an outline in the Google Doc that Tim St. Clair had linked, and we can work on filling more details in there, but keep the conversation going a little asynchronously then. Anybody have any last thoughts they want to throw out there today?
I'd just like to see more discussion about the incentives that everyone's been mentioning, but that can happen on the doc.
So Justin, do you want to give a brief background? There have been some conversations outside, but tell us about what you saw and
yes, awesome.
your worry.
So the thing which motivated this in my mind was that we had the recent Docker CVE, and my understanding is that Kubernetes 1.11 is still in our window of I'm trying not to use the word support, but let's call it S, because there was a question about what support means in our S window. And yet Kubernetes 1.11 was only qualified or tested at the time with a Docker version, which is no longer gets that CVE fix. And so the question is, what do we do about Kubernetes 1.11, but also in general, how do we, as a project, try to offer that? What does it mean to have we aren't even really hitting a 9-month S window right now if there is no way to continue running that cluster for more than, say, 3 to 6 months because your dependencies are no longer supported or no longer getting fit patches. And I think it's a question of what are we really saying, what should our bounds be in terms of where do we expect to have a working set of components, maybe at least one working set of components, and should we take on that burden of backporting fixes to them if the vendors do not, which of course then implies that we would look at our dependencies much more closely. But yeah, I just wanted to sort of try to understand how we feel about this and where we see this going as we move forwards.
Was the Docker version statement specifically around Docker shim, or was that at all? So there are two ways you can use Docker, right? You can point the kubelet directly at it and it uses it via Docker shim, or you can point the kubelet at a CRI socket and that socket implementation can talk to any container runtime. Docker could be one of them, right?
Yes.
So which version was the limitation around?
My understanding is that we did not test any CRI implementations with 1.11. And so it was only Docker shim, and we only tested up to 1703 with 1.11. I can pull up the line if.
I think maybe the specifics of this case are maybe not as relevant as the general case, which is if we give users something and we say, you can install this and we will look after you for the next X years, and we define what this is, do we take responsibility for all the things that this relies on as downstream dependencies? And if so, how does that actually work?
I think that's a great summary. Thank you, Quentin.
I would say that we literally can't. I mean, ultimately, no matter how many people it impacts, Kubernetes itself is based on what the various vendors and other employers are willing to put into it. And on top of which, if we're looking at core Kubernetes, we're increasingly supporting a very large array of plugins. Even at this point, when we're looking at something like Docker, yes, 90% of users are using Docker as a container runtime, but it's not the only container runtime we support. And even for Docker, as Jordan pointed out, there's 2 different ways to install it. So I think, so this thing is sort of S window is that I think we need to carve out an exception where if we have a dependency that breaks, even for a purported LTS release, we will either break compatibility, if that's the way to fix the problem, or stop supporting it. I just don't think realistically the Kubernetes project has the resources to commit to backporting fixes to upstream projects.
I think a portion of the answer, I agree with you, Josh, that it's probably not possible to make a hard guarantee that all of these are going to work for the set of time, just because there's so many and they all have their own schedules or not. There are things that we would depend on that don't have a formal support stance even. But for certain key componentry like this, I think the right solution is kind of already happening as a result of the CVE. The folks in test infra were discussing, hey, for 1.14, which Docker should we be on so that their support stance, which is public, will actually run through 1.14's support lifetime. So for some things, you can have visibility on that and make a choice like, hey, we should push this component forward so that we're testing with something that will have the right longevity.
And isn't part of the point of having the stuff like the CRI and the CSI to make this problem go away? That then, you know, if you're using the CRI and the CRI is relatively stable, then you actually don't care what version of Docker or whatever, as long as then it's Docker's problem if they don't implement the CRI, or Containerd's problem, or whatever else you're talking about's problem. You know, if they don't implement that specific CRI spec properly, then, you know, and the same goes for CSI and the CNI and whatever other similar things we do.
It's part of why we give the end-to-end test suite out to the wild, right? It's part of why we publish these artifacts so that they can run their whatever, you know, incantation they've chose and mixture that they've chosen to create a cluster, that they can run the same set of tests that we run for a given release. And if it doesn't pass, then, you know, that's up to them. And that's where the vendors have to come in and step up, right?
And they can fix those things. If they find an incompatibility or a security issue, they can fix that out of band of any Kubernetes release or update and revalidate against multiple versions of Kubernetes with those artifacts.
Yeah, I guess the other one that I've thought of that has impacted me in the past is the cloud provider stuff, which is a similar idea.
The problem with both Docker and cloud provider is that they aren't completely decoupled yet. And I know DIMS is currently working on the Docker shim part for the kubelet, but there's also the cloud provider extraction has taken eons. And it's like I don't know if it's like a promise now. It's some political promise. But in an ideal world, you know, we'd actually have a timeline for when that actually comes to fruition. But as long as we have the test apparatus, any provider, downstream provider, should be able to test these things.
I guess my concern is that we've seen like Docker not backporting previous versions. So I like the idea of making sure that we have dependencies that at least promise to do those backports. But it does seem like when we should have some notion that it is possible to have a Kubernetes cluster that will continue to survive without relying on some vendor, even if we have to downscope what Kubernetes is, which we sort of are doing when we say, like, we're excluding cloud providers, for example. But I very much like the idea of looking at dependencies and requiring them to be longer than the Kubernetes support or S window.
Or as a contrast, I like the idea that if we're looking at an LTS release, that the LTS applies only to the defined APIs, CSI, CRI, cloud provider interface, and that any in-tree dependencies are not included. It would give a real incentive to the people who have not been putting a lot of effort into extracting things to actually give more thought to it.
One question I have here, Justin, is what would you think was the right outcome here? Should we move the 111 tests to Docker 1706?
That would be good. We could also just in future make sure that our core dependencies, that we have forks of them. We are gradually getting there anyway. Like we used to have a bunch of external dependencies. Now I think we will shortly have CRI under our control. We'll have etcd under our control. There's not a lot left. And I think we just need to embrace that and say we will have a working set of dependencies that we will support for the S window.
If you're talking about the interfaces, like the clients and the interfaces that we depend on, I agree that the way we call these APIs we support should be under our control. But I don't want a Kubernetes flavor of etcd and a Kubernetes flavor of Docker that we are taking over maintainership of. Is that what you're suggesting? I misunderstand.
The Kubernetes project isn't, but the same people are, right? With the view to making sure that Kubernetes works. So it's sort of semantics, I'd say. Like GKE employees, for example, are doing this, right?
But that is part of what distros are supposed to do.
And can we embrace that work that they do, I guess?
Yeah, that's maybe the question, yeah.
Or should we? And my answer to that is no.
It depends upon what the contract or what are the claims that we are giving to a release, right? The requirements will feed down from whatever we state, right? So if the requirement is that we should support some stable/LTS version for a time window of X, then we actually need to be able to back that up with tangible, real progress and ability to do so. Otherwise, it's a false promise, right?
I suppose then the things around CRI, they're like an implementation detail of how we deliver the contract that we have said we're going to. Maybe that makes it easier for the project because there's less change surface to manage, and then you make you're giving a clear demarcation point of where the change service exists.
I think the answer to solve this, so we're not in the world of backporting everything forever, is for providers to beef up testing automation as much as humanly possible, because they should be incentivized to do so. Because without that, that means that somebody in the core is going to have to maintain backports. That's going to be who exactly?
Would this also extend to, say, Flannel?
Or insert arbitrary CNI thing. Yeah.
Yeah, everything.
I think we should have a set of providers to create a conformant Kubernetes cluster that has a support window that is compatible with whatever S window we want to do. And if there is we need an existence proof, in other words. I think if there is no way to create a Kubernetes cluster that lasts more than 3 months before it is completely insecure, then it's a little bit of a lie to say that it lasts even 9 months.
But again, we can't be responsible for the providers, right? You can't build a cluster without having a CNI plugin and having storage and having that sort of thing. But imagine that, we choose Weave as our CNI plugin for our demonstration cluster, and then something happens to WeaveNet, and they stop making releases. Are we going to take over their work? I don't think so.
We would have to.
I disagree. I think what we're actually supporting is the APIs, and that the provider is incidental, and that we might have a demonstration cluster, but we reserve the right to change the providers in that demonstration cluster at any time.
I think that's reasonable to change the implementation. I think that's okay.
If we get to the point of saying that what we do in our core test is a reference implementation or a reference set of implementations, there's going to be some mutability within that. But that's in those words, like saying this is a reference implementation for our core test. We're not saying that we make a distribution that is sort of the pure pristine upstream that one could solely use without a vendor in the mix.
I think a fundamental problem is that we haven't been rigorous enough in our testing apparatus to ensure that the touch points of integration have a full suite that exercises all the capabilities and all the incantations we can think of. Because if we actually had that, every time a new CNI would potentially integrate, the changing of versions would be pretty much a standard operating procedure. Same with CRI, same with storage, right? But our test suite has been something. It's been bondoed to a given state, which we maintain, but we don't actually really go ahead and try to really beef it up, to be honest.
Well, part of the problem there is a lot of technical debt in the testing infrastructure. So any new test you want to add is difficult. And there's currently refactoring all over the place. Also, like you cannot test everything. Like basically the landscape of cloud is so complex that the testing matrix is impossible.
Sounds like we don't have a consensus. I think that would be my summary.
I mean, there are things that are clearly within what we must test and support, and that is the API points that we call out to. Like at one end of the spectrum, like the the API that we say people should integrate with us via should be tested, and that must be supported by us on our end from the client side, like what we call out and what we consume. Beyond that, like how far beyond the APIs out into specific implementations, the Kubernetes project is responsible for taking over maintainership of from negligent or understaffed or defunct providers. I guess it's an open question. It doesn't seem that open to me. I don't think that's in scope for the Kubernetes project. But
I'd argue this in scope for the LTS working group, right? And I think it's an important, the reason I think it's important is because I think one of the things that has made our life difficult is that we have all these projects that are moving at very fast paces, very fast paces. And there are a lot of, I don't know, yes, ignore grammar. and if we had, for example, stable branches of Weave and Docker and all of these things, would that actually have been less work to maintain?
I don't think the answer is us taking over maintainership. I agree with Tim. The answer is more rigorous testing and better information about what versions of Kubernetes these things support. So if you're trying to choose a provider and you care about long-term support, it would be useful to be able to see, oh, well, this provider actually like certifies compliance back with the last 6 versions of Kubernetes, and they have like a sliding window of 1.5 years that they test every release. Like having information like that available would be very helpful for people who are trying to choose a provider. But I think it's much more about a testing and documentation and surfacing the support statements from the providers. I think that's where we should push.
I think this can also affect the Kubernetes sort of posture regarding dependencies. So, I mean, there's similar discussions happening in CNCF at the moment, for example. And the only reason I mention this is that, you know, to take a concrete example, currently Kubernetes relies on etcd. And so we could view that as an, you know, external dependency. We don't care if etcd is like totally vulnerable or breaks or whatever. We kind of don't have any responsibility. But fortunately, etcd is also part of the CNCF. And the CNCF has graduation requirements regarding, you know, multiple vendors and support and bug fixes and all these kind of things. So that may mean that Kubernetes could decide we would rather rely on etcd because part of the CNCF and subject to the CNCF stuff than some other thing which we have much less influence or control over. So it might not solve the problem 100% in that the Kubernetes project itself may not take full responsibility for patching every CVE in etcd, but kind of transitively we can either be more confident or less confident in the things we depend on, and that may influence things like architectural decisions.
As you integrate open source, you constantly have that demand to figure out whether something you've chosen has viability for the long term. And the same applies beyond just CNCF, maybe whether there's a stronger statement there, but everything that's in our vendor directory has that same potential.
Yeah.
And those we kind of implicitly would appear to be supporting since they're sitting there within our code base. It's up to us to mutate them.
So Josh brought a very good point at some point that we don't have a clear definition what are external dependencies, and we don't have a different qualifications for the different external dependencies. So etcd obviously is a core one, but something like Funnel, I mean, we can be broken with a certain version of Funnel, but we still do not define what version of Funnel was supported for a release. So I think we should obviously we cannot like cover everything in a document, but we can cover like the most popular bits and define what is core and what is like less core. I think we should do this before like taking any steps with tests and such.
Yeah, I think one way the support statement could be we support a version of CRI, CSI, CNI, and we have tested for a particular version of Docker, etcd, our CSI, that would help us not claim support for a particular version of Docker and only a CRI. And when situations like this would happen, like how Justin mentioned, maybe a vendor would come forward and say, I'll fix the Docker version, or so that we can continue, the users can continue to use that particular version of Docker in their deployments.
At that point, you have what Justin was saying, I guess, the existence proof point in time, but you still have the question of existence proof. Can you keep something integrated and stay secure for more than a month? Well, we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to bump the survey stuff and see if we can do it asynchronously, discuss that. And really interesting conversation and exactly what we're hoping to drive with this working group. So thank you all.
I think the survey's pretty hammered out.
Yeah, I think we can
a couple-
nail it down asynchronously.
And actually just get it out before the next biweekly meeting, because
Yeah, definitely.
And there's only a matter of separating some of the questions in vendor versus user.
Yeah.
I don't think it's that complicated. I think we can just do this in Slack.
Yep, I think so too. So barring any objections, we'll do it in Slack. If you care passionately, pay attention there, and object if you see something needing objected to, or thumbs up likewise if it looks good. So we'll get it out in the next couple weeks. Thank you all for joining, and good conversation today.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, Ben.